The morning mist clung to the Tennessee hills like a shroud of death, and Colonel James Thornfield could feel it in his bones something terrible was coming. As he adjusted his field glasses and peered across the rolling landscape near Chickamauga Creek, the veteran officer of the Army of the Cumberland knew that September 19th, 1863, would be etched in blood and memory forever. The creek's name, derived from the Cherokee word meaning river of death, seemed prophetic. As Union and Confederate forces converged on this seemingly peaceful corner of northwestern Georgia, what had begun as Confederate General Braxton Bragg's attempt to recapture Chattanooga was about to explode into the second bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War. Claiming over 34,000 casualties in just 2 days of hellish fighting, Major General William Rosecrans had pursued Bragg's Army of Tennessee southward from Middle Tennessee. Believing he had the Confederates on the run, the Union commander's confidence had grown with each mile. His Army of the Cumberland spread across a 40-mile front as they advanced through the mountain passes, but Rosecrans had made a critical miscalculation. Bragg was not retreating. Instead, the Confederate general was setting a trap, reinforced by Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps from Virginia, giving the rebels their largest concentration of force in the Western Theater. Thornfield watched as his men of the 21st Ohio Infantry prepared their equipment. In the pre-dawn darkness, these were seasoned veterans who had fought through Stones River and Tullahoma, but even they seemed to sense the magnitude of what lay ahead. The sounds of an army preparing for battle filled the air. The metallic clink of bayonets being fixed, the soft murmur of final prayers, and the distant neighing of cavalry horses. As referenced in Harper's weekly coverage of the battle, the terrain itself would play a crucial role in the coming slaughter. The dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine would fragment formations and turn the battle into a series of brutal, close-quarters engagements where men would die within arm's reach of their enemies. The thick undergrowth would swallow entire regiments, making command and control nearly impossible once the fighting began. The Confederate plan was ambitious in its scope. Bragg intended to use his numerical advantage, nearly 66,000 men, against Rosecrans' 58,000 to crush the Union left flank and drive the Army of the Cumberland back toward Chattanooga in disarray. But plans rarely survived first contact with the enemy, and both armies were about to discover that the forests around Chickamauga Creek would become a labyrinth of death where brother fought brother. In some of the war's most savage combat, Private Samuel Morrison of the 9th Indiana crouched behind a fallen log, his Springfield rifle trembling in his hands. At 19, he had already seen more death than most men witnessed in a lifetime. But something about this morning felt different. The very air seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the earth itself was holding its breath before the storm broke. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the canopy, the sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives began to echo through the woods. The rebel yell, rising from thousands of Confederate throats as they launched their attack. The Battle of Chickamauga had begun, and before it ended, the creek would indeed run red with the blood of America's sons. The first volleys shattered the morning stillness like thunder, and within minutes the entire left flank of the Union line erupted in chaos. Brigadier General John Brannan's division, positioned near Reed's Bridge, bore the initial brunt of the Confederate assault as waves of gray-clad soldiers emerged from the forest like ghosts materializing from the mist. Colonel Thornfield found himself in the thick of the fighting as his 21st Ohio was rushed forward. To plug a gap in the line, the forest had become a nightmare of smoke, screams, and muzzle flashes. Trees that had stood for decades were splintered by artillery fire, their branches raining down on soldiers who fought in a green hell, where visibility extended barely 20 yards in any direction. The Confederate attack, led by Brigadier General Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry and supported by General Bushrod Johnson's division, struck with terrifying precision. Forrest, the brilliant cavalry commander who had risen from private to general, used his mounted troops to probe for weaknesses in the Union line. Before directing the infantry to exploit every gap, they found. Private Morrison found himself separated from his unit in the chaos, stumbling through the undergrowth as bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. The young soldier had lost his bearings completely. the thick canopy above blocking out the sun and making navigation impossible. Round him, the sounds of battle created a symphony of horror, the crack of rifles, the screams of wounded men, and the splintering of wood as artillery rounds found their mark. According to contemporary accounts in the Cincinnati Gazette, the fighting in the forest was unlike anything the war had yet produced. Men fired at muzzle flashes in the smoke, often unable to tell friend from foe until it was too late. Entire companies became lost in the woods, sometimes firing on their own men in the confusion. The thick undergrowth meant that wounded soldiers often lay where they fell, their cries for help lost in the din of battle. General Rosecrans, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain control of his scattered forces. His headquarters, established in the Widow Glenn's cabin, buzzed with activity as staff officers tried to piece together reports from the front. The Union commander had divided his army into 3 corps under Generals Alexander McCook, George Thomas, and Thomas Crittenden. But the forest was making coordinated movement nearly impossible. The Confederate assault continued to build momentum. As General Bragg committed more troops to the attack, the rebels had achieved something rare in Civil War battles: local numerical superiority. At the point of contact, as Union reinforcements rushed to support Brannan's beleaguered division, they found themselves facing not just the initial Confederate assault but fresh waves of attackers, who seemed to emerge endlessly from the forest depths. Thornfield rallied, his men behind a makeshift breastwork of fallen logs and rocks, their rifles adding to the wall of fire that was slowly beginning to slow the Confederate advance. But even as his Ohio veterans held their ground, the colonel could see the bigger picture developing. The Union left was bending dangerously, and if it broke completely, the entire Army of the Cumberland could be rolled up like a carpet. As the morning wore on, the battle expanded along the entire front. What had begun as a Confederate probe had escalated into a full-scale assault, involving nearly 60,000 men fighting in terrain that seemed designed by nature itself to maximize carnage. The forest floor, carpeted with fallen leaves from previous autumns, was being churned into a muddy soup mixed with blood and gunpowder. The first day of Chickamauga was becoming a preview of the industrial slaughter that would characterize the war's final years, but fought in a setting that harked back to the frontier conflicts of America's past. In these ancient woods, the modern world was being born in violence and death. By midday, the battle had evolved into a series of desperate, disconnected engagements scattered throughout the forest. General George Thomas, commanding the Union 14th Corps, had earned his nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga, through his stubborn defense of the left flank. But even Thomas was beginning to feel the immense pressure of the Confederate assault. The sound of battle had become a constant roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. Artillery pieces, dragged with enormous difficulty through the forest paths, boomed at point-blank range. The famous Confederate batteries under Captain William Preston's command had found positions where they could enfilade the Union lines, sending shells screaming through the trees to explode among formations of blue-clad soldiers. Private Morrison had managed to rejoin his unit, but the 9th Indiana was barely recognizable as the regiment that had marched into battle that morning. Of the 400 men who had answered roll call at dawn, fewer than 200 remained in ranks. The rest lay scattered through the forest, dead, wounded, or simply lost in the maze of smoke and trees. Colonel Thornfield's Ohio regiment had been pushed back 3 times, each retreat costing them dearly in casualties. The veteran officer had seen enough battles to recognize when a line was about to break, and he could feel that moment approaching. His men were running low on ammunition, their faces blackened with powder smoke, their uniforms torn by branches and enemy fire. The Confederate momentum was building. As General Bragg committed his reserves to the attack, the arrival of General John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade, transferred from the Army of Northern Virginia, had given the rebels fresh impetus. These were veteran troops who had fought at Gettysburg just 2 months earlier, and they brought with them a ferocity that shocked even the battle-hardened Western soldiers. As documented in the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, the fighting reached a crescendo round 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when Hood's Texans struck the Union center. The Confederate assault, spearheaded by the 4th Texas Infantry, broke through the Union line at the Brotherton Farm, creating a gap that threatened to split Rosecrans' army in half. General Rosecrans himself came under fire as he rode between his scattered units, trying to maintain some semblance of command and control. The Union commander's usually immaculate uniform was torn and stained, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. Staff officers fell around him as Confederate sharpshooters, hidden in the treetops, picked off anyone who looked like an officer. The crisis deepened when a misunderstood order created a gap in the Union line. Just as Longstreet's corps launched their main assault, General Thomas Wood, commanding a division in the center, received what he thought was an order to pull his troops out of line. When Wood's division withdrew, it created a quarter-mile gap in the Union defenses exactly where Longstreet was preparing to attack. Longstreet, Lee's old war horse, seized the opportunity with the tactical brilliance that had made him one of the Confederacy's most feared commanders. His assault, led by Brigadier General Jerome Robertson's Texas Brigade, poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. The Union right flank collapsed almost instantly, sending thousands of Federal soldiers streaming toward the rear in panic. The Confederate breakthrough was so sudden and complete that it caught both armies by surprise. Entire Union regiments simply disintegrated as Confederate troops struck them in the flank and rear. The carefully maintained battle lines that had defined Civil War combat dissolved into a swirling melee where individual units fought for survival. Thornfield found himself commanding a mixed group of soldiers from half a dozen different regiments, all united by their desperate need to escape the Confederate onslaught. The colonel had lost contact with brigade headquarters, had no idea where his superiors were, and was operating purely on instinct and experience. His makeshift command fell back through the forest, fighting rearguard actions against pursuing Confederates who seemed to appear from every direction. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the smoke-filled trees, it seemed certain that the Army of the Cumberland was facing complete destruction. The Confederate tide appeared unstoppable, and only the approaching darkness offered any hope of salvation for the retreating Union forces. As the Union right flank crumbled, and thousands of Federal soldiers streamed toward Chattanooga in panic, one man stood between the Confederates and complete victory. General George Henry Thomas, the Virginia-born Union officer who had chosen loyalty to the nation over loyalty to his native state, gathered the remnants of his corps on Snodgrass Hill and prepared to make the stand that would define his legacy. The hill itself was unremarkable, a gentle rise covered with the same dense forest that had characterized the entire battlefield, but its position was crucial. From Snodgrass Hill, Thomas could command the approaches to Chattanooga and potentially allow the rest of Rosecrans' army to escape destruction. The general, a massive man with a graying beard and calm demeanor, set about organizing his defense with the methodical precision that had made him one of the Union's most reliable commanders. Colonel Thornfield's mixed command had been swept up in Thomas's defensive preparations. The Ohio officer found himself commanding not just his own regiment survivors, but also men from Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky units, all of them veterans who recognized that this hilltop might be where they made their final stand. The soldiers worked frantically to construct breastworks from fallen logs and rocks, knowing that the Confederate assault would come soon. The Confederate pursuit was led by General Longstreet himself, who had tasted victory and was determined to complete the destruction of the Union Army. His corps, reinforced by units from other parts of the battlefield, approached Snodgrass Hill with the confidence of men who had just witnessed their enemy's line collapse. The Confederate general could see the prize within his grasp, the complete annihilation of the Army of the Cumberland. Private Morrison, his uniform now more gray than blue from powder smoke and dirt, found himself in the front rank of Thomas's improvised line. The young soldier had lost his original rifle somewhere in the retreat and now carried a weapon stripped from a fallen Confederate. His hands shook as he loaded and primed the unfamiliar musket, but his eyes remained steady as he watched the gray line approaching through the trees. According to battlefield reports later compiled by the War Department, the fighting on Snodgrass Hill represented some of the most intense combat of the entire war. The Confederate assaults came in waves, each one threatening to overwhelm the Union defenders through sheer weight of numbers. Thomas's men, fighting with the desperation of cornered animals, met each attack with volleys that lit up the forest. Like lightning. The battle for Snodgrass Hill lasted for hours. With neither side able to gain a decisive advantage, the Confederates would surge forward, only to be driven back by the devastating fire from the Union breastworks. Then Thomas's men would launch a counterattack, driving the rebels back down the slope before being forced to retreat to their original positions. The hill became a charnel house where men died by the hundreds for gains measured in yards. As the sun began to set, ammunition became critically low for both sides. Thomas's men were reduced to firing captured Confederate weapons and stripping cartridges from the dead. The general himself moved among his troops, his calm presence steadying men who had been fighting for their lives for hours. His nickname, the Rock of Chickamauga, was being earned with each repulsed Confederate attack. The crisis came near sunset when Longstreet massed his remaining strength for one final assault. The Confederate general could see that his men were exhausted, but he also recognized that the Union defenders were at the breaking point. This attack would determine not just the fate of Snodgrass Hill, but potentially the outcome of the entire campaign. Thornfield watched the Confederate preparations with growing alarm. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his men were down to their last cartridges, and he could see the massive gray formation preparing to advance. The colonel checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded, and prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible. Round him, soldiers who had fought through the bloodiest battles of the war prepared for what might be their final moments. The Confederate assault began with a yell that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Thousands of rebels charged up the slope, their battle flags streaming in the evening breeze, their bayonets glinting in the fading light. This was the moment that would determine whether Thomas's stand would be remembered as a heroic last stand or a successful defense that saved an army. The final Confederate assault struck Snodgrass Hill like a hurricane of steel and fire. Longstreet's veterans, their battle flags riddled with bullet holes, surged up the slope with the fury of men who had already tasted victory once that day. The sound of their battle cry echoed through the forest, a primal roar that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. Colonel Thornfield's improvised line wavered. Under the impact of the Confederate charge, his men, exhausted and nearly out of ammunition, fired their last rounds and prepared to meet the enemy with bayonets and rifle butts. The Ohio colonel drew his sword and revolver, knowing that in the next few minutes he would either die on this hill or witness one of the most remarkable defensive stands in military history. Private Morrison found himself face to face with a Confederate soldier who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. For a moment, the two young men stared at each other across their rifle barrels, both recognizing the terrible randomness of war that had brought them to this moment. Then training and instinct took over, and they fought with the desperate savagery of men who knew only one of them would see another sunrise. The battle lines dissolved into a swirling melee where individual courage and determination mattered more than grand strategy. Thomas's men fought with clubs, rocks, and their bare hands when their weapons failed. The Confederate attackers, equally desperate, pressed forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades, driven by momentum and the knowledge that victory was within their grasp. Just when it seemed that Thomas's line must break, salvation arrived in the form of General Gordon Granger and his reserve corps. Granger, who had been positioned several miles away, had heard the sound of battle and made the crucial decision to march toward the guns without orders. His fresh troops, led by General James Steedman's division, struck the Confederate flank just as Longstreet's assault reached its climax. As reported in the New York Tribune's coverage of the battle, Granger's arrival turned the tide of the fighting. On Snodgrass Hill, the reserve corps, consisting of veteran regiments from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, hit the exhausted Confederate attackers with devastating effect. The rebels, who had been on the verge of victory, suddenly found themselves caught between two fires and began to fall back down the hill. The psychological impact of Granger's appearance was as important as the tactical advantage. Thomas's men, who had been fighting a desperate holding action for hours, suddenly realized they were no longer alone. The arrival of reinforcements gave them renewed strength and determination, and they launched a counterattack that drove the Confederates back in confusion. Thornfield, his sword blade notched from close combat, rallied his men for one final push. The Ohio colonel had been wounded twice during the fighting, a bullet grazed across his left arm and a bayonet cut on his forehead, but he refused to leave his post. His mixed command, inspired by their leader's example, charged down the hill with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. The Confederate withdrawal was not a rout, but it was decisive. Longstreet's corps, bloodied and exhausted, fell back to regroup while Thomas's men maintained their positions on Snodgrass Hill. The immediate crisis had passed, but both armies knew that the battle was far from over. Darkness was falling, and both sides would use the night to prepare for another day of slaughter. As the shooting died away, the true cost of the day's fighting became apparent. The forest floor was carpeted with the dead and wounded from both armies. Soldiers who had been enemies just minutes before now worked together to carry wounded men to safety. The ancient rituals of war, the temporary truces to collect the dead, the sharing of water with enemy wounded reasserted themselves. In the growing darkness, Thomas, his uniform torn and stained with blood and powder smoke, surveyed the battlefield from his hilltop position. The general had successfully prevented the complete destruction of the Army of the Cumberland, but at a terrible cost. His corps had suffered enormous casualties, and he knew that the morrow would bring fresh Confederate attacks. Private Morrison, somehow still alive despite the day's carnage, helped carry wounded comrades to the makeshift field hospital that had been established behind the lines. The young soldier had aged years in a single day, his boyish face now marked with the 1,000-yard stare that would become so familiar to veterans of America's wars. The Battle of Chickamauga's first day was ending, but its legacy of blood and sacrifice was just beginning. Dawn on September 20th, 1863, broke gray and sullen over the battlefield of Chickamauga. The morning mist seemed thicker than the day before, as if the very air was heavy with the spirits of the dead. Colonel Thornfield stood among his men, now reduced to fewer than 100 effectives from the 400 who had answered roll call days earlier, and watched the fog slowly lift to reveal the carnage that surrounded them. The night had brought little rest for either army. Both sides had spent the dark hours reorganizing their battered formations, caring for their wounded, and preparing for what everyone knew would be an even more terrible day of fighting. The forest, which had witnessed such slaughter the day before, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of fresh horrors. General Bragg, despite his army's failure to completely destroy the Union forces, still held the tactical initiative. His Confederate Army of Tennessee, though bloodied, remained intact and determined to finish what they had started. The Confederate commander had reorganized his forces during the night, placing General Leonidas Polk in command of the right wing and General Longstreet in command of the left, with orders to renew the attack at dawn on the Union side. General Rosecrans had managed to stabilize his lines, but his Army of the Cumberland was in desperate straits. The previous day's fighting had cost him nearly a third of his effective strength, and his men were exhausted, demoralized, and running low on ammunition. The Union commander knew that his only hope lay in holding his positions long enough to organize a withdrawal to Chattanooga. Thomas, still holding Snodgrass Hill, with the remnants of his corps, had become the anchor of the entire Union line. The Virginian had spent the night moving among his troops, checking defenses, and preparing for what he knew would be a fight to the death. His men, inspired by their commander's calm determination, had worked through the darkness to strengthen their breastworks and prepare for the Confederate assault. According to accounts preserved in the official records, the second day's fighting began with a thunderous artillery barrage that shook the earth and sent trees crashing down throughout the forest. The Confederate guns, positioned on the high ground, poured shot and shell into the Union lines with devastating effect. The Federal artillery, hampered by the difficult terrain and reduced ammunition supplies, could offer only sporadic reply. Private Morrison, now serving as a company runner due to the heavy casualties among the officers, found himself carrying messages between isolated Union units. The young soldier had seen enough death in the past 2 days to last several lifetimes. but he continued to perform his duties with the mechanical precision of a man who had learned to function despite his terror. The Confederate assault, when it came, was even more ferocious than the previous day's attacks. Polk's wing struck the Union left with the fury of men who knew they were fighting for their cause's survival. The rebel yell echoed through the forest as waves of gray-clad soldiers charged the Union breastworks, their bayonets gleaming in the morning light. Thornfield's Ohio Regiment, now little more than a reinforced company, met the Confederate attack with the disciplined volleys that had made them famous throughout the Western theater. The colonel, his left arm in a makeshift sling from the previous day's wound, moved among his men with his revolver drawn, adding his voice to the crash of musketry that greeted the Confederate charge. The fighting quickly devolved into the same close-quarters combat that had characterized the previous day's battle. Men fought with rifles, bayonets, swords, and anything else they could find. The formal lines of battle dissolving into a dozen separate melees scattered throughout the forest. The thick undergrowth and dense canopy turned the battlefield into a nightmare, where death could come from any direction. But this time, the Confederate assault carried a different weight, the knowledge that this was their last chance to destroy the Army of the Cumberland before it could escape to Chattanooga. Bragg had committed his reserves, and every available man was thrown into the attack. The rebels fought with the desperation of men who knew that failure meant the loss of Tennessee, and possibly the entire Western Confederacy. As the morning wore on, the pressure on Thomas's position became almost unbearable. Wave after wave of Confederate attackers surged up Snodgrass Hill, each assault bringing them closer to breaking through the Union lines. The Rock of Chickamauga found himself commanding not just his own corps, but a collection of stragglers and survivors from across the Army of the Cumberland, all united by their determination to hold this crucial position. The final hours of the Battle of Chickamauga unfolded with the tragic inevitability of a Greek drama. By midday on September 20th, the Union Army was fighting for its very survival, while the Confederates pressed their advantage. With the knowledge that complete victory was within their grasp, the forest that had witnessed so much carnage over the past 2 days was about to see its final, bloodiest act. General Longstreet, commanding the Confederate left wing, had identified the key to victory: the destruction of Thomas's corps on Snodgrass Hill. The Confederate general massed his remaining strength for one last, overwhelming assault. Every available man, from veteran infantry to dismounted cavalry, was thrown into the attack. The Confederate battle line stretched for nearly a mile, a gray wave of humanity preparing to crash against the Union defenses. Colonel Thornfield, his uniform now unrecognizable from dirt, blood, and powder smoke, gathered his surviving officers for what he knew might be their final conference. The Ohio Regiment had been reduced to fewer than 60 men, and ammunition was critically low. The colonel looked into the faces of men who had followed him through 3 years of war, and saw the same grim determination that had carried them through Shiloh, Stone's River, and a dozen other battles. "Gentlemen," Thornfield said quietly, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of battle, "we have held this position for 2 days against everything the rebels could throw at us. Whatever happens in the next hour, history will remember what we did here." The officers nodded silently, understanding that their commander was asking them to die well. Private Morrison, still somehow alive despite the odds, had been assigned to Thomas's headquarters as a courier. The young soldier watched the Confederate preparations with growing dread, knowing that his regiment, his friends, were about to face an assault that would dwarf anything they had yet experienced. The weight of survival guilt, the terrible randomness that had kept him alive while so many others had died, pressed down on him like a physical burden. The Confederate assault began with the largest artillery barrage of the entire battle. Every gun that Bragg could bring to bear opened fire simultaneously, creating a thunderous roar that could be heard 20 miles away in Chattanooga. The Union lines, already weakened by 2 days of fighting, trembled under the bombardment. Trees that had stood for centuries were shattered into splinters, their massive trunks crashing down among the Union breastworks when the artillery fire lifted. The Confederate infantry advanced, Longstreet's corps, supported by units from across the Army of Tennessee, moved forward with the precision of a military parade. Their battle flags, shot through with holes but still flying proudly, marked the advance of some of the finest soldiers the Confederacy had produced. The rebel yell that accompanied their charge seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The Union defense was magnificent in its desperation. Thomas's men, knowing they were vastly outnumbered, met the Confederate assault with a wall of fire that momentarily staggered the attackers. The Rock of Chickamauga himself moved among his troops, his calm presence steadying men who were facing what seemed like certain death. His example inspired acts of heroism that would be remembered long after the battle had ended. But courage alone could not overcome the mathematics of war. The Confederate assault, pressed with relentless determination, began to find gaps in the Union line. Rebel soldiers, screaming their battle cry, poured through the breaches and began rolling up the Federal defenses. What had been an organized, defensive line began to dissolve into individual groups of soldiers fighting for their lives. Thornfield's regiment made its final stand round the regimental colors, the tattered flag that had carried them through so many battles. The colonel, his sword broken in hand-to-hand combat, fought with his revolver until his ammunition was exhausted, then continued with his bare hands. His men, inspired by their leader's example, fought with the fury of cornered wolves, selling their lives as dearly as possible. The end, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. Thomas, recognizing that his position was no longer tenable, ordered a fighting withdrawal. His corps, or what remained of it, began to fall back toward Chattanooga, conducting a masterful rearguard action that prevented the Union defeat from becoming a complete rout. The Rock of Chickamauga had saved the Army of the Cumberland from destruction, but at a cost that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the sun set on September 20th, 1863, the Confederate Army of Tennessee held the field of Chickamauga. They had won a tactical victory, but at such a terrible cost that it would prove to be the beginning of the end. For the Confederacy in the West, the battle had claimed over 34,000 casualties, making it the second bloodiest engagement of the entire Civil War, exceeded only by Gettysburg in its scale of slaughter. The creek that had given the battle its name, Chickamauga, the Cherokee River of Death, had lived up to its ominous meaning. In the words of one Confederate survivor, "We have won a victory, but at such a cost that another such victory would destroy us." The Battle of Chickamauga had ended, but its legacy of sacrifice and valor would echo through American history, a testament to the courage of men who fought and died in the service of their beliefs. However divided those beliefs might have been, the forest would eventually heal. But the scars of those 2 September days would remain forever, marking the spot where a nation's sons had written one of the bloodiest chapters in the American story. Colonel Thornfield, Private Morrison, and thousands of others had become part of that story, their individual acts of courage and sacrifice contributing to a narrative that would define a nation and shape its future. The Battle of Chickamauga was over, but its echoes would resonate through the ages, a reminder of the price of freedom and the courage of those who paid it.